Diabetes, we are looking at a machinery in the cell, okay, that uses glucose to produce energy. There's an input area for glucose and out comes energy. Now we've talked about there is a molecule or a gate opener or door unlocker called insulin. Insulin has to open the door to the cell in order for glucose to be let in, to come from the blood into the cell, right? We've talked about the analogy of producing chocolate, similar to in a factory producing chocolate, similar to this factory producing energy using glucose as raw materials. We've talked about if there is excess cocoa that's coming in, cocoa plant, that gets processed to produce chocolate. If there's excess, it's going to be stored in containers. And if the storage containers are full, then either the cell refuses to take any more, or the factory refuses, I can't store anymore, or it just throws it in another corner in within the factory. Depends, right? In the case of the cell, when the storage, the entry area is full with glucose and the blood is still containing a lot of glucose, so the glucose in the blood is high, continues to be high, the signal continues to go out from the brain to the pancreas, telling the pancreas to produce more insulin. If there is continuous increase in blood glucose, the brain is going to continue to indicate to the pancreas to produce insulin. Insulin is supposed to assist in removing that glucose from the blood and pushing it into the cells. Insulin is like a gate opener or door opener into the cell for glucose to come in. Okay, so now when there is too much glucose in the blood, more and more insulin would be produced. Now imagine that more and more glucose gets delivered to the cell, this factory, which is the cell. The cell puts the extra glucose into storage containers and say, okay, well, I'll store this. When I'm done processing what is in the feed, I'm going to use these guys, and hopefully, I will be able to continuously produce energy, which we need. However, there's more and more glucose coming through the doors. So what does the cell begins to do? The cell begins to push or create long-term storage of this glucose. Okay, and your long-term storage molecule is fat. Okay, it is fat. The cell begins to form long-chain fatty acids, fats basically, and it starts to store this fat within the cell all over the place, and say it stores the fat close to the door, and then now that fat begins to mount until it finally clogs the keyhole where insulin is supposed to unlock the door and allow in glucose. So insulin, there's still high levels of glucose in the blood. Insulin now is still constantly being produced by the pancreas from the messenger of the control center, which is the brain. The brain tells the pancreas to produce more and more insulin because it is sensing a lot of sugar or glucose in the blood. Okay, more insulin comes out, more insulin to help the whole situation, to try to push in this sugar away from the blood into the cells, and it's finding it difficult to do that because fats, which are long-term storage of glucose molecules, have been formed, and now they are clogging the keyhole. That's really what is happening in the cell in this disease called type 2 diabetes. These are almost early stages of the disease. What do we see then? There is a high level of glucose in the blood because not much of this glucose can be pushed into the cell anymore. there is a high level of insulin. So this disease is actually described as insulin resistance. Insulin resistance because the insulin is being produced, unlike the type 1 case where insulin is not produced. Insulin is being produced by the patient or the person. However, the insulin cannot function, cannot unlock the door into the cell and push in glucose, because that door, that keyhole, has been clogged. Get it? So now this disease is considered insulin resistance because sugar cannot get into the cell where it's supposed to go in to produce energy. So guys, high levels of glucose in the blood, not good. It does a lot. If it's much too high and it's staying for a long period of time, a lot of harmful processes kick in. Okay? High insulin has other functions in the body. But then insulin also, helps to signal the liver, which is also some storage, also stores excess glucose, signals the liver to store that glucose into fat, so the person begins to put on weight. There is, in the liver, when these fats are being produced, they will be sent out in order to be stored as in fat cells, right? There are specific cells to store fat, but when this is exhausted as well, also the liver begins to deposit that fat within its tissues, which is now called fatty liver. It's the beginning of a disease called fatty liver disease. Also common in people with diabetes or long-standing uncontrolled type 2 diabetes. So people, what you have now is insulin resistance, and insulin is high in the blood as well as glucose is high. As we have seen, most of this underlying problem in type 2 diabetes comes from our lifestyle. I will tell you one reason why we say lifestyle is quite important, and it is a very important factor in reducing or treating diabetes type 2. There is another process, okay? Say there is another door for that factory called, that's factory which is the cell, right? There is another door other than the door which opens to insulin's key. There is another door, but that door only opens, listen carefully, that door only opens when we exercise. When we exercise, there is a door that opens to allow glucose, specifically glucose, because we need more energy processed. So this extra door opens without the need for insulin, folks. Is this genial or what? Okay, so during exercise, glucose port or glucose entry doors extra entry doors can open without the need for insulin to come and unlock that door. That door opens when you exercise or when we exercise. So there you go. A second extra door that can be triggered only by exercise. So that's it. That's how diabetes type 2 gets formed. Those are the kind of effects of type 2 diabetes: higher glucose in the blood, high insulin, too high for too long, detrimental to many organs in the body. Now let me say something about pancreas before I close up this video. Okay, the pancreas, we've said, is that organ that produces insulin. All right, the pancreas has multiple other functions, one of which is producing insulin. Now, talking about analogies, let's take another analogy that makes this quite clear. Okay, say you run a marathon. If you're a runner and you run a marathon, or whatever sport you're good at, and you do your maximum time, okay? Say you run a marathon, let's continue with that one, it makes it clear. You've practiced for a year, for a year, and now you are capable of running 26 miles. All right, maybe 3 hours to 2.5 hours. I did run half a marathon. I took about 2 hours, so that was it for me, but it was wonderful. I was tired at the end. Now you come at the end of the marathon, you get to the finish line, you're excited, and you're, oh, I made it. And someone tells you you've got to run the marathon, another marathon, same time, without much rest. You're gonna kind of frown a little bit. I am tired. You're like, what? You've got to run another marathon right away. Get going. And if those forces were to push you to go, you continue to go. Probably because you've practiced for only one marathon. Okay, believe me, I'm sure there are people who can run 50 miles at one go. But here, if you practice for 26 miles and you practiced over a year, your body is geared and set to do that amount of time, at the end of which you will be pretty tired. You would have used on major amount of energy. Okay, you will be reasonably tired, and you will not be prepared to do another marathon. And if you're forced for whatever reason to do immediately another marathon, another 26 miles, get going. This is what happens to the pancreas when it has pushed out so much insulin, and yet the sugars in the blood are still high. The brain constantly sends that signal, you've got to get me insulin out there to push out this sugar from the blood, away from the blood, into cells. The pancreas now puts out insulin. But because the levels of sugars, or glucose to be specific, is very high and constantly continues to be high for uncontrolled diabetes type 2, the pancreas eventually fatigues, gets tired, similar to that person who has run already a marathon and has to run a second marathon. They might at some point just collapse and stop running, or they just simply sit down because their legs can't carry them any further, or just, lay on the ground because they cannot move any step further. Late stages of diabetes type 2 is going to look like this for the pancreas. Uncontrolled high blood glucose is going to lead to an eventual fatigue of the pancreas, at which case and at which stage the pancreas stops producing insulin. And when the pancreas stops producing insulin, the sugars go really high. And at this point, a type 2 diabetic begins to look like a type 1 diabetic, and would need and require insulin until at a later stage when maybe reversal has begun. Now guys, tune in for the next video as we talked about statistics and we talk about reversal of type 2 diabetes. Lots of studies out there, lots of interesting things, a lot we can do. Let us take charge of our health. Guys, if you have not yet subscribed, please subscribe. Please share this video. Share this video. It might just help the next person who will be able to control their diabetes. In my next video, you're going to hear about the statistics and what the trends look like. I think you can imagine. You can see yourself living all over the world. More and more people getting sicker.